10. Don't eat me. The glowing amber eyes were joined by a long orange and black snout. Winston squeaked, stumbled on the slippery floor, and fell backwards as the face of a fox loomed over him. Winston and the fox looked at each other for a moment, and then, at the same time, they cried, "Don't eat me," and leaped away from each other. It took Winston a moment to realise what had just happened. "Me?" he said, too bewildered by the idea to be frightened. "Eat you?" The fox in the shadows looked at Winston from under a trembling paw. "Yes," he said, "you might gobble me up." Winston couldn't help himself. He started to giggle. "I won't gobble you up," he laughed. "Are you sure?" asked the fox suspiciously. Winston nodded. "Absolutely sure. I don't think mice eat foxes. I don't, anyway. I much prefer cake." He picked up some of the spilt cake from his travelling box and held it out to share. The fox took it hungrily, but continued to look at Winston with large, worried eyes. Winston tidied his scarf and then stuck out a paw. "I'm Winston," he said. The fox gingerly took Winston's paw. "I'm Heinz Schmuddelig. If you aren't going to eat me, what are you doing here?" Winston slumped down on the edge of the now crumpled macaroon box and told the fox everything. All about his journey from Mistletoe Street to Paris, then to Germany. "You did all of that?" gasped Heinz. "That's very brave." Winston wasn't sure if it was, really. "Well, maybe," he said. "But you see, I know I just have to solve my very curious mystery. I'm hoping someone here will help me." But, he thought sadly, that seemed a long way off now. The parcels from the train had long since vanished into the crowd, and with it Winston's chance of being delivered to where he needed to be. He was completely lost. "Well," said Heinz, "I think it's very brave. I wouldn't be able to do any of that. I'm not a very brave fox. I live here behind these bins and only sneak out when people aren't looking. The world is a bit too big for me, big and scary, and I worry about things a lot." Winston rubbed his nose for a moment, thinking. Heinz was obviously all alone in the world, and Winston knew how that felt. Before he'd met Oliver, he'd also been all alone. Winston knew what it was like to sneak about in the shadows, because that had been his life too. But if his adventures had told him anything, it was that the world was big, yes, but it was also full of kindness. And especially at Christmas, when the air was full of magic. Winston decided then that he wanted to help Heinz. He wanted to help him be braver and to see the magic fizzing around him. Suddenly he had an idea. "I need to find a library," said Winston. "I don't suppose you know where it is, do you? It's an enormous old one, full of hundreds and hundreds of books." "Oh, yes, I know where lots of places are," said Heinz eagerly, "even though I haven't actually been to them. Look!" He pointed to the tatty cardboard box he slept in, under a blanket of crumpled maps dropped by people who visited nearby tourist offices. "I study them when I can't sleep at night. They have all the important places in town on them. I can't read the words yet, but I can read the pictures." "Do you think you could take me to the library?" said Winston. "And I can show you how magical Christmas is on the way." Heinz didn't look very sure. "We won't be gobbled up, will we?" Winston put his paws on his hips and stood heroically. "Fear not," he cried. "I will gobble up anyone who even thinks about eating you. I promise." And he crossed his heart and tried to look as brave and majestic as possible. With cars hooting and bustling about, Winston could see why Heinz could be frightened. But, just as he'd predicted, the air was also full of winter magic. It was much colder here than in Paris, and Winston was glad that he had Heinz's warm fur to nestle into. He sat up by his ears and kept leaning forward to reassure him and point things out to his new friend. He showed him in the sparkling ice on the branches of tall, decorated Christmas trees, and how shop windows glowed like lanterns, painting the cold pavements outside with dazzling yellows and oranges. As they waited to cross the road, Winston showed Heinz how to throw back his head and catch enormous fluffy snowflakes on his tongue. It wasn't long before Winston noticed that a sparkle had crept into his eye. "See," he said, "magic is everywhere. You just have to look for it." As the night set in, the city began to twinkle with thousands of new flickering lights. "We're almost there, I think," said Heinz. They turned the corner and found themselves in a wide square, across which the library loomed. But the square was far from empty. Winston's whiskers wobbled as his belly rumbled as he sniffed the hundreds of smells sizzling in the air from the enormous market in front of them. Winston was just about to suggest they took a little, tiny trip to look at some of the stalls and maybe have a little, tiny nibble of some food when a movement caught his eye. A bemitted woman was standing at the half-open library door, fumbling in her handbag for a key. "Oh no," cried Hines. "She's shutting the place up." The door seemed to be the only entrance. If it got locked up tight, the answer to Winston's very curious mystery would be locked up inside with it. "We have to get in," said Winston. "But how?" Just then a crowd of children playing in the snow tumbled into view. They were in very giddy spirits, and Winston watched as one of them, a cheeky-faced scallywag, rolled up a snowball and hurled it at the library. It splattered against the door just above the librarian's head. She spun around and frowned sternly. Her eyes narrowed. The children stopped still and held their breaths. Winston held his, too. The children were in for a terrific telling-off. He just knew it. But then, to everyone's surprise, the librarian grinned. She swooped down, scrambled about in the snow, and made a gigantic snowball of her own. The open door to the library behind her was quite forgotten as she patted her icy grenade and took aim. "Quick!" squeaked Winston, and like a flash Hines dashed through the door, just as the librarian fired her snowy missile at the hooting children. A moment later the door closed with a heavy clunk, and Hines and Winston found themselves locked inside the deserted library.